just give an indication when you are live. That would be brilliant.
Okay, it's live now, Steve.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you very much. So Phil, whenever you're ready, we're still waiting on a couple of members, but we're almost there.
Okay. I'm minded to start because it is a hot day and we don't want to be sat waiting overly long. So welcome those that are already online. Can I start, Stephen, with, have you had any apologies? Welcome.
So I haven't had any apologies. Just looking at the list, we are still waiting for Councillor Joe Harris and Councillor Lisa Spivey. They're the only two. Everyone else has joined.
Okay.
Excuse me, Chair. I pass the apologies on from Joe Harris. He can't.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah. So yeah. Okay. It's just Lisa. Okay. We'll start then with the minutes of the last meeting of this committee. It's pages 1 to 12. I'd had a look at them. There's one thing jumped out at me, but I'm looking at members who were part of that to comment or make a proposal in relation to the minutes. That would be Jeremy, Andrew.
And
Phil, there's two meetings that you're taking approving the minutes for.
So I was just going to say, Phil, on that one, both the minutes of the March meeting, which was obviously the previous council, and the last meeting have been included. At this stage, they're just to make sure members can note them, because until it's a formal meeting, you can't approve it. We'd pick that up in September, but I was conscious time going on, the memory's gonna challenge you a little more. So just wanted to make sure members were relatively happy with them at this stage.
Okay. Okay. Well, I might pick up the item that's jumped out at me when we come to the monitoring session, and that's around SIL from the March meeting. Yeah. Okay. Declarations of interest then. Nothing on this agenda that I wouldn't have thought that has that potential. No. Okay then. We'll move on to the work plan. Who or would anyone like to raise anything that they feel urgently should be in the work plan? There are a few issues, but a lot of them, or some, will be picked up by the various scrutiny committees anyway. Anybody got any burning issues? Jeremy, yeah.
Got John as well.
Thanks. Yeah, I was just picking up on the terms of reference of this committee. The strategic overview of services, cost-cutting and scrutiny, but also carry scrutiny functions of the county council, delivering roles of Article 8 of the Constitution, scrutinising those council functions not covered by other scrutiny committees. These include support services included within the core council group. So, Stephen, tell me, what services of the county council are not covered by other scrutiny committees that we ought to be looking at? Because, Chair, I don't think we want this dry situation that all we're getting is reports which are identical, other than a few figures changing each month, which are just the performance stats as the sole agenda items. I noticed when I went back earlier on, there was things like back a couple of years. In this time there was reports going into the council's land holdings and this disposal. So I just wonder if Steve could give us an idea of a number of issues which could be put on the agenda, or we could have a proper report on them.
So I wouldn't be able to give you a list of all of the different things that this committee necessarily doesn't cover and the other committees don't. You have in the Constitution the terms of reference for all of those other committees. And I think the suggestion would be that those committees would provide quite a good cover across all of the council services. I think one of the things for this committee to consider is those issues that might cross a number of committees, and to provide clarity, you could then identify bringing those committees together to hear an item. Although I'm conscious as I'm talking, I'm getting a lot of orange triangles, so I think my connection is struggling. So I'll just stop there.
I think we're all struggling. Just to add there, Chair, and for Jeremy, of course, this committee picks up the corporate core of the council as well. So that's, you know, those are the areas that are not picked up by the other scrutiny committees. And when you have your and you have your financial monitoring and you have your performance stats, and the performance stats do cover the corporate core of the council.
Okay.
Chair.
Yeah.
Of course, when that constitution was written, we didn't have the directorate called corporate resources, which is effectively what corporate core meant. So we do now. So if there are areas under my jurisdiction or under corporate resources that you want further look at, then by all means we can have that discussion. And Jeremy, if there's something you want us to discuss out of the meeting and have a think about separately, if there are either new areas of development or areas that members either individually or collectively are concerned about, happy to take that away and do some research for colleagues.
Well, I mean, I certainly think that having another the committee I was looking back about 2 years, looking at the report on our land holdings that we've got, on what we're planning to dispose over the cabinet does get a report, but I do think we ought to be looking at our strategy for maximising the benefit from our land holdings, and I just wonder whether that might be something worth having a look at at some point in the autumn.
Yep. Okay.
So, Chair, happy to do that. I guess my only bit of and I don't know how it was done 2 years ago. I do know that since I've arrived, we have formalised the report that goes to Cabinet every 6 months. Mm-hmm. And I'm happy to go through that again if you want. Just bear in mind that some of that information that is in the report that goes to Cabinet is exempt. So that might be the only bit we might have to have a general discussion. But actually, if we get into individual sites and what they're worth and what their plan might be, we might have to do that in exempt session.
I mean, another thing we might be worth looking at is the council's commercial income as well, and how well it's generating that commercial income. We know, for example, because of the lockdowns, that the income from parking revenues, which is not directly commercial income, has been hit hard. But I mean, I know the district councils probably do better as a proportion, but we ought to be looking at how we can drive forward the county council's commercial income if it's from energy generation or something like that, so that we actually help support our revenue budget. So I think that, it's those sort of areas, Chair, that I think we need to be having a good conversation so that we can feed into the cabinet to improve the services of the county council, rather than just taking these very dry performance targets where we ask a few questions and we get a couple of answers, but we actually don't do any policy development or any investigation. And I just think that this committee, the last thing I want to do is sit on this committee for a whole year and just see these reports come every cycle, and we just look at stats and we just look like we're nitpicking on the stats rather than doing some collective work.
Okay. Yeah.
And Chair.
I'm not obsessing you on my Rob.
Yeah.
I was just thinking this is quite the billing you're giving me, Jeremy. I'm sure the rest of the committee are waiting in eager anticipation of my item following that advert.
If probably move on, because I've got 3 other people indicated already, but Lisa's joined us. Welcome, Lisa. Right. Okay. I've got John Bloxham next, then Andrew, as in Andrew M, and then I've got Don.
Right. Thank you, Chair.
just a technical point to start with. In this agenda item, the hyperlink to the forthcoming executive decisions doesn't appear to work. So could that be corrected, please? My suggestions for things to pick up, and I'll take advice on where these might sit, are we ought to do some work around our rural estates. And I know we've just had a discussion about disposal strategy, but I think we also should have a look at our strategy around the assets that we've retained. In particular, I know that in the past there was a strand of work around the rural estates, county farms, that we continued to hold, and there was member engagement around that because there was a working group associated with that. So I think there's quite a lot of interest now around what is the nature of that land, what's its soil quality, what's our food policy in terms of what that land is used for, and how does that fit with our agenda around climate change and carbon reduction. So I think there's a set of work around that, looking at our county farms. I think there's a need for a strand of work around equalities, and for whatever reason that seems to have stalled as far as I can see. Comparing and contrasting what Gloucester City's doing to what the county's doing, there's an obvious contrast. You know, there's a group up and running within the city. It's also an external facing commission that is taking evidence from the wider community. I'm not getting a sense that the county is doing that. And looking at the draft strategy, I don't know if we're taking comments on it, but looking at page 3, we've got this paragraph called an inclusive county, and the second sentence in that has got something in about the protected characteristics, equalities in relation to that, but it's not highlighted as a specific point, and I think it could do with highlighting and as progressing that strand of work. And as it isn't active at the moment, as far as I can see, I think it would be good to scrutinise that. The last point I'd make would be around housing. I note that in the strategy it says under page 20 that we should refuse to be constrained by organisational boundaries. So while I acknowledge that the county isn't a housing authority, housing is a critical issue, the supply, but also the nature and quality, affordability and access to accommodation. They're big issues, and I think we ought to have a strand of work around that. And if that doesn't sit inside one of the other scrutiny committees, then we ought to be looking at how is that going to be reflected within our scrutiny work. Thank you.
Thanks, John. I'll come back to that in a sec. Andrew, you're next. Andrew Miller.
Okay, so a couple of things. Firstly, I want to respond to Jeremy, but also ask an opinion of the officers. My understanding of corporate overview and scrutiny was essentially that we could raise any issues which were in the county's council's prerogative or to do with the services, but were not being covered by any of the main scrutiny committees. Obviously, the understanding is that the vast majority of the work would be covered by the set of scrutiny committees that we've got in place. But that, if anything, fell between the gaps, that we could pick it up here. So that's the first thing. Now, I had a second thing in terms of forward work planning that I would like to be put on the agenda for the September meeting of this committee. And I've already had some discussions with Steve Mawson about this. And it's with regards to the procurement toolkit and its incorporation into the procurement strategy. Now, I understand that it's a very extensive piece of work, so I hadn't expected to get a comprehensive answer for this meeting of the COSC. But I would like to see that on the agenda for the September meeting, to have an update on how the procurement toolkit has been incorporated into the procurement strategy and how we think that that's going to contribute towards achieving the council's motion to reduce single-use plastics, which those of us who were in the last council remember voting on as a motion a couple of years ago. Is that that reasonable? Yeah.
Shall I come back on that, Chair?
Yeah, please.
Yes, you're right. You're right, Andrew, in terms of this committee picking up where there are any gaps. But what we're trying to avoid, and something that happened during the last council, and it's something that relates to your committee, Children and Families, is that we had quite a detailed presentation come into this committee when, in fact, your committee was dealing with that. So I think the normal expectation is if members have got a particular interest in that from this committee, they can always go in and observe your meetings rather than this committee effectively duplicating what your committee is already doing. So it is here to pick up the gaps rather than to do the same thing. And we had 1 or 2 occasions in the last council when we did that. But yeah, the procurement toolkit is something that can come to this meeting. I'm just sort of seeking some guidance from Steve really in terms of sort of how he sees that.
Yeah, I did say to Councillor Miller that I'm more than happy to bring an update. I think, and we had an officer meeting scheduled for this week, unfortunately, that fell over. I think I'm blaming the heat on the IT system, but it fell over, so we couldn't quite get it through it. But currently, there's a very detailed discussion that has got well over 100 separate items that officers are going through. But I'm more than happy to bring back an update on where that detailed discussion is getting to. And of course it covers a range of activities, but not just single use, but plastics. There's a range of, local spend, all that kind of stuff, which I'm more than happy to come back and update on.
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, the reason for me pressing the issue, obviously, is because I was on that working group in the first place. I'm conscious that the working group had some issues towards the end because of COVID, and also because the chair of the task group had some medical issues. But what I'm really keen to do is to ensure that whatever is put in place is going to be the main way in which we deliver the council motion to reduce our use on single-use plastics. I'm sure one of the officers could remind me the date by which we said we would do that.
Okay. I've still got a few hands up. John, have you got something else, or can you take your hand down? Dom, I got next anyway. Steve's still got a hand up. There was a question there from Andrew. Officers, I think it was around the date.
I think we'll need to come back on that, Chair.
Yeah.
We'll look it up.
Okay, well, it's fortunate that Dom's the next speaker, because, of course, this would fall under very much, I would have thought, environment scrutiny. Dom, welcome. You're next up.
Thanks, Phil. Morning, Chair. Morning, all. Every day is a school day for me, and I'm sorry, this is my first meeting. But in terms of issues that are falling between the cracks, for me, there's the growing issue around the cumulative impact of mineral mining extracting across Gloucestershire that, in my mind, and again with the caveat that I'm new, seems to be falling between planning and environment scrutiny. Permissions are being given without full consideration of environmental and planning impacts in the round, i.e. beyond single sites that are being proposed, and my sense is it's falling between 2 committees. Happy to be shot down on that and told otherwise, because, as I say, it's my first day in school, or this particular school. But thanks, Chair.
Well, I'm not going to play Ed Baster, but up until this year, I was chairing county planning. So, and of course, there was a fair bit of quarrying. And in fairness, we do have, of course, the minerals local plan. That means we must deliver a quantity of minerals. I'll have a conversation with you offline, and I'm sure probably the lead planning officer would also perhaps like to be part of that. I do know the problems, because, of course, being on planning, I've heard communities, the outcry from communities about extraction. So I know where you're coming from. Let's put it that way.
Thanks, Jan. I think just to add to that, the communities have basically come together across the county geographical boundaries and have submitted a letter of concern to Wiltshire, Swindon and Gloucestershire County Councils. I think it's going to be escalated anyway, so just giving you a heads up. But thanks, Phil. Appreciate that.
Okay, thank you. Do you want to comment on the single-use plastic thing, Dom? I mean, you put together the environment work plan. Or is that something you can take offline with your clerk and with Dem Services as to when you might slot that into your agenda? Or our agenda?
I think it's fair to say the agenda's quite rammers at the moment. I'm happy to take it if committee members want, or at least to ask the question. But being really honest, I'm going to struggle to get it in this year because of the various other bits and pieces that have come through the pipeline.
Okay. We will negotiate with officers. Steve, your hand stood up. Did you want to come back in on something? Steve Morrison.
Yes, and it's kind of just on that point really. So of course it's the constitution is written of such it's matters that are not covered by other committees, not that are in other committees' jurisdiction and they don't have time to do. So for example, happy to have a debate on assets and stuff. I think if we start getting into soil management, that is clearly an issue for the Environment Committee as part of the climate change activity. In terms of housing, I'm happy to have a general discussion on housing, but of course that is also Economic Growth Scrutiny Committee. So I guess the one that I think is firmly in this committee and worth a discussion about, and I'm sure Mandy might want to come on this is the equalities point that colleagues raised. So I think there are ones that are safely in other committees' boundaries, and that is up for that committee if you wanted to recommend to the chair to take that away and discuss that. I think the overarching ones are relevant. And of course, I'm not going to labour this point because we'll come to it later on. The overspill, if a one issue item becomes wider than that single committee. So children's social care, for example, we are all aware of the issue in children's social care and the overspend, and we'll come to that later. And the risks and challenges around social care. That is one that ends up going into slightly more wider boundary because it's the ramifications that end up overspilling. So I think that's also the, so if, for example, I don't know, housing started overspilling just from economic growth position to several committees, then that's when you might want to bring it into the remit of the Corporate Overview and Scrutiny Committee. So yeah. I think we need to bear that in mind in future planning as well.
Okay. I've still got hands up from Andrew and Dom. Are you looking to come back in? Right. Okay. Mandy might want to come in. Stephen, you've just popped a hand up. Stephen Hurst. You're on mute. You're on mute, Steve.
Thank you very much, Phil. I remember a recent planning committee meeting regarding the expansion of a quarry in the North Cotswolds. We had a long debate about cumulative effects, and the planners were really most reticent to consider cumulative effects. So I think it's an interesting subject which does need taking further.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you're both on the Cotswolds, so I do understand. Perhaps I'll take something offline with the head of planning services and maybe do something, because it really is it's an environmental issue, but it's also obviously a planning issue. So I've made a note of it. Let's put it that way.
Thank you. Thanks.
And see where we can get. Thank you.
Chair, before you move on this work plan item, it's worth just making reference to the fact that this committee, of course, is the lead body for budget scrutiny. So that's one of the most significant roles of this committee. So that we need to make sure we've got time in the work plan, and there will be time allocated for that.
Yeah, I was going to ask about budget anyway, as to what we're doing Normally it would go, the great debate would be in January, but the work goes in advance. Were we thinking the autumn?
Yes,
I could just comment on that, just to say that normally what you would get is for your agenda items, kind of September, November, you would be provided with context, and Rob does a piece of work in September on that. You have a date in the calendar in January when you would look at it. And what I can do is I can show you that agenda and that plan. I was going to say, obviously, you're raising a number of items. We can develop a work plan from that. There'd be a work plan item at every committee meeting anyway. So at the next one, I can provide a copy of the work plan based on these items and an agenda for budget scrutiny, so you can see where we're heading.
Yep. Okay.
Chair,
Thank you.
Could we clarify the process around this particular item? I see the agenda says to discuss any items. My understanding is this is an online meeting, we're not making decisions. So obviously some of us have responded to the request that we pitch some ideas in, and officers have responded to that. Some of those may relate to other scrutiny committees, some of them may relate here. So I'm not quite clear, how is this the outcome of this discussion going to be reflected in the decision that's made around the work plan? Where does that sit? Thank you.
Are you happy for me to come in? Just to say that we've scheduled in a work plan, which I think I've sent you an invite to, John. So,
okay.
So lead members will take a look at the draft work plan, decide whether they're happy with it. That will then come back to the next meeting of the committee on the work plan item. And it's something then that you've got that evolves over time, and you can kind of add to and take away as needed.
Right, that's the meeting in early September.
Yeah, that's the one. Yeah.
Okay.
I see Mandy's indicated, but Chloe has as well. So I'll go to the member first. Chloe.
I just wanted to second John's request about the rural estate, actually, because it's not clear to me where else that would sit. So I'd like to hear that as well.
Yeah, thanks, Chloe. Mandy, I suspect this is on the equalities point.
Absolutely on the equalities point. The workforce equality work, impact on culture, the sort of cross-cutting issues, absolutely. There is a bit of complexity because a lot of our external equalities focus has been around the health inequalities agenda as a result of COVID, and it was particularly the Director of Public Health's annual report was on this subject, and that's where a lot of the focus is. So I just need to take that and have a look at it, how that cuts across HOSC and this, but certainly a big part of the equalities agenda would come here.
Thank you. Anyone else before we move on? Chloe's hand's still up. Sorry, Chloe. Thank you. And Mandy presumably is finished on that item. Okay. Certainly plenty in there for us to be considering. And thanks, Stephen. I know you'll work it up and bring it back in September. I'm going to move on to this is Rob's time to shine. Rob Aidith and the performance report, which is as short as ever. Your pages 13 to 52. Are you running through that on screen, or are you taking it that members have got it on a second device or whatever?
I was going to ask Stephen if he would share the slide set on screen, and then I'll just run you through to those if that would be helpful.
Happy to. I'll put the slides up now. I was just going to say a note of caution, which is I keep getting the orange triangles and the buffering. I don't know if everyone else is getting that. If, for example, I lose connection, just to remind members that you do have the slides in your pack. So if it does go down, you do have them somewhere else. So just bear with me while I put it on screen, and fingers crossed.
Thanks, Stephen. So I will give a little context than I ordinarily would, because I'm conscious that we've got some new members of the committee who won't necessarily understand the background to some of these indicators. So forgive me, those of you who are more seasoned members of the committee, if some of this is old news to you. The other thing I'd point out is we are quite late bringing this report this time because of the timing of the election and and the impact of that on the committee timetable. We are bringing this report much later than we normally would in the annual cycle. Nevertheless, because it's a year-end report, I think it's important to give the committee that. And as I said, it will serve that useful purpose of setting some context for our future discussions. I'm happy to take questions, but I'd ask if we can leave those until the end of my presentation, not least of all because often questions that you ask may be addressed by a later slide. So I think it's more helpful if we take those at the end. So if we can just begin with the next slide, Stephen. This just gives you a very broad overview of where the council's performance was at the end of the year. And you'll see that that we group indicators into three categories: on or ahead of target, within tolerance of target, so that means within 0 to 5% of the target, or greater than 5% of the target. For those of you who've been around long enough, as have I, to remember the Audit Commission days, they would set their tolerances at within 10% of target, so anything within 10% was considered to be on target from their point of view. We're slightly more stringent than that and have set ours at 5. But you'll see that at the end of the year, 69% of the indicators that we measure at corporate level were on or ahead of target using that definition, leaving 31% just behind. And that's pretty much where we'd been for the latter half of the year, and an improvement, a significant improvement on where we were at the end of the previous year. As you can see, that's the bottom graph there, where we were down at 60%. And I think given the context of COVID and the impact of that across a number of services, that was a really pleasing position to be in at the end of the year. But the next slide begins to break that down a bit and give you some of the performance headlines that begin to illustrate that picture. So Stephen, if you're still with us, if you could move it on to the next, that's fantastic. So there were some real achievements and successes in our performance in the year, and I won't read these through to you in a list because you can see them on screen for yourself. But I think it's important to note that despite the challenges of the year, we did make significant progress and exceeded a number of our targets as a council. But there were areas equally where we saw the impact of COVID on targets. So areas that we might otherwise expected to have achieved our targets on were most definitely knocked off track by the impact of COVID, and that blue box lists those. Probably of more interest and more pertinence to the committee's discussions today, though, are the orange and red boxes on that graph, which show in orange those areas that are either newly off track or where we've got further away from targets during the quarter. And also in the red area, a number of issues of long-term improvement for us, some of which we're making progress, others which are more stuck. And the focus of my next slide really focuses on the bottom half of that screen. So within the context of very good performance in a couple of areas and generally good performance, particularly when you take into account the impact of COVID, we have nevertheless got some medium and longer term challenges that I'll take you through in the next couple of slides, as well as highlighting some of the real success stories. So let's go into that in a bit more detail, and we'll begin by looking at children's services. And in this slide, how well those services are responding to initial referrals of children and young people where there's a potential concern. You're looking at three separate indicators on this graph. The blue one looks at initial decision making. So that's when a referral comes into the MASH. How quickly are we categorizing the level of risk and assigning that to a team to take further? And you'll see that throughout the first half of the year, we were doing really well against that indicator. We took quite a significant hit at Q3, and those of you that were on the council at that time will remember that was something that we flagged in this report at the time as an area of concern. That has since increased in Q4, and towards the end of the year we were doing better on that indicator, but still short of the target levels. So we aim for 90% performance in this area, and we hit 80 by the end of the year. Now you're looking at a quarterly figure there. So towards the very end of the year in March, performance had improved and it has remained better since. Nevertheless, it isn't where we want it to be, and that's an area that we do need to give some attention to make sure that that's brought back on track. You'll see the other two indicators, performance was either at or near target levels and much better. So that's initial visits. So having made a decision that a social care assessment is needed, how quick are we in getting out to visit that child and or its family? And that's an area that a year or so ago we were really struggling with, but towards the end of 1920 we'd seen some improvement. We got on target, and that's remained pretty much on target since, despite the challenges of lockdown and COVID. And then finally, the indicator on single assessments. So having been out and visited the child, we have 45 days within which to complete an assessment of their need. Again, an area which in the wake of Ofsted in 2017 was quite drastically off track. We've seen gradual improvement over the course of the intervening years. And at the end of Q4, that was the first time we'd actually exceeded that target. And that's a really important achievement in terms of our readiness for re-inspection. If we can go to the next slide then, Stephen. This is looking at stability of placement for children in care. I'll pause at this stage and explain that within the children's data set, we've got a mixture of measures, some of which are about the speed of our response and whether we can quickly assess the needs of a child and intervene where that's needed. Some are about the more long-term impact of our interventions on those children and young people. So having intervened, do those children and young people get the response they need? Does that make a lasting difference in their life? And then there's a third set of indicators that are really about the quality of provision for children and young people. This indicator falls into that third category. The reason I talk about them in those three terms is obviously some things will turn around quicker than others. So we knew that the last inspection, our focus first had to be on the speed of our response, making sure we were a responsive service, making sure that children weren't subject to drift and delay, because until you've tackled that, you can't begin to reduce needs and risk in those children's lives. But as the intervening years have passed, the focus has turned much more to quality and making a lasting difference in terms of outcomes to children. But we know that those things are going to be longer to turn around, not least of all because some of these children have been subject to interventions by the council over a long period of their lives. And therefore, you've still got the legacy of what's happened in earlier years that you're carrying. Just returning to this slide then, this is looking, as I said, at one of those measures of quality, which is once a child comes into care, first of all, how stable is their placement? Are we able to put them in a placement that sticks and where they're able to stay for a significant period of time after having come into care? And that graph on the left looks at that, and you'll see that it's an area which we've struggled. So we still have 16.6% of children in care who within 12 months have had 3 or more placements, and obviously that's not good for their outcomes and something that we need to continue to focus on improving. And then on the right-hand side, of all of the children who've been in care for at least 2.5 years, how many have been in a stable placement for 2 years or more? Our statistical neighbours are at 68%, and we are lower than that at 61%. Now, it's worth bearing in mind that we set our targets for children and young people against good and outstanding authorities, and we know that that's not where we are yet, but it's important to have that level of ambition. But nevertheless, we are falling short of those targets. These are challenging things to turn around because they are dependent on the market having suitable placements available in which to place children, but they are also a measure of the quality of our social work and whether children are coming into care in a planned way. You will see over recent months in Cabinet and over the next 6 months, we'll have a lot of reports coming forward which are around securing the right placements and the right provision for children and young people. And that's exactly to tackle these kind of issues, so that children coming into care can have stable placements that meet their needs and that last, that stay in place for a long period of time, and are able to provide them with that support. So that's what this slide is illustrating, and it's a journey on which we've still got further to go. Next one, please, Stephen. This looks at another aspect which is much more focused on the quality of the interventions that we're putting in place with children and young people, and this is a more challenging picture. So this looks at three measures of children's social care. First of all, re-referrals. When a child comes into the MASH, have they been through the system previously? Is it a child that's already been known to us, so is coming back into the system for a second or subsequent time? Secondly, children on child protection plans. At the point at which they go onto a plan, is this their first plan, or have they been subject to plans previously? And then finally, readmissions into care. When a child comes into care, is this their first care episode, or have they been through care previously, come out of care, and are now having to come in again? You'll see this is a challenge for us, and it's been a consistent challenge over the last year and further back in time than that. We still have a high proportion of children coming back into the system at all three of those levels for a second or subsequent time. However, at the end of the quarter, we did see quite a marked improvement in the number of children coming into care for a second or subsequent time. So we are beginning to see the first signs of improvement in these kind of measures, but we've still got further to go on those as well. Next slide. Those are measures that will take a long time to turn around. In the meantime, there are measures that we could look at that take a shorter term look at whether quality is improving, and this is one of those measures. So this looks at the length of the percentage of children who've been on a child protection plan that has lasted for 2 years or more. Obviously, you want to minimise the length of child protection plans. Ideally, when we're intervening in children's lives, it's making a difference, it's reducing the risk, and they can come off the child protection plan because it's no longer needed. So if we've got an increasing number of children subject to plans for more than 2 years, that's a potential source of concern. You'll see, though, that actually that's been reasonably stable. The number of children on longer plans did go up at the end of Q3. We think that's partly due to the impact of COVID and the backlog through the courts, but actually that number's coming back down and is now very nearly at our target level. You'll also see that in terms of comparing our performance to our statistical neighbours, with the exception of that Q3, we've been performing better than our neighbours. So at the end of the year, we had 16 children who were on plans for more than 2 years, and I know from evidence that Children's Services provide that each one of those is reviewed on a very regular basis and has strong management oversight from senior managers. So I think this is a sign that our quality of practice is improving and that children are being dealt with, children's needs are being met in a timely way. Next slide, please. Moving away from children's, this looks at adult services. It's a rather busy slide, but what it's showing is the total number of people receiving long-term ongoing care funded by adult social care. The different colours are the different categories of care. So going from the bottom up, because you probably can't see the slide, nursing dementia, nursing care, and then going up towards the top of the slide, community-based care. So broadly speaking, the further down the chart you go, the higher the level of intervention, the higher the level of needs, the higher level of cost. And our strategy for the last 3 years has been, wherever possible, to meet people's needs in the community, and therefore to reduce the rate of admissions into residential and nursing care. Now, obviously, COVID has had an impact on that in 2 ways. One, there has been increased pressure from hospital discharges. Hospitals have been under pressure and therefore have been keen to get people out of hospital quickly, and that places additional pressure, particularly on residential care in the short term. But you've also had the opposite effect to that of, for those people moving into leading care, not as a result of a stay in hospital, residential has been a less attractive option, and so there's been much more demand for community-based care. Having said that, what this graph shows is that actually, despite those pressures, we have continued to deliver on that strategy. We have continued to see increased levels of need met within the community, an overall reduction in the number of people requiring long-term care, and less reliance on residential care. So it really is a positive story that despite the pressures that the last year's placed on the adult social care system, that long-term strategy of reducing dependency on long-term care is continuing to be delivered. Next slide. One of the areas of potential concern for us, though, is that the reducing level of the reducing proportion of service users who've had a review or a reassessment of their needs within the last 12 months. Best practice would dictate that every person who's receiving ongoing care should receive a review or a formal review or reassessment of their needs every 12 months. That was a target that we were struggling to meet towards the end of last year, at the beginning of this year. You'll see performance was down around 33%. We have begun to see a marked increase in performance, partly because not all of the reviews and reassessments were being captured on the system, and therefore we weren't getting credit for the work that was still being done. And you'll see that once we started including them, it showed an improved position, but still only just above our target of 50%. Now, that's not a particularly ambitious target. It's a target that's set to be realistic. It's what we think we can achieve, and that target will gradually be notched up as we see improvement in that area. And it's good that we are now exceeding that target, but it's an area that we need to sustain that improvement and continue to raise our ambition to make sure that people's needs are being reassessed in a timely way. Next slide, please. This is the first of the areas where we have seen a real impact of COVID on performance. So this is looking at people who are receiving treatment for alcohol, opiate, or non-opiate use. And this was an area where our performance, you can see in the table at the bottom, had been high prior to COVID. Not only have we been meeting our own targets, but our performance had compared well with other comparator authorities, but you can see that it has taken quite a hit as a result of COVID, and we are seeing fewer successfully leaving treatment and remaining alcohol and drug free. Now, comparator data is still emerging on this. It's an area where it takes a while for the data to reach us from the Department of Health. But from what we are seeing from other areas have seen a similar decline, which is why I'm confident that it is an impact of COVID rather than a local problem. Nevertheless, as we come out of COVID and as lockdown restrictions ease, this is an area where we would want to see an improvement back to the levels that we had previously. Next slide. These two slides look at renewable energy generation from the council estate and council carbon emissions. And again, this is a positive story. We've only given you short-term trends here, but I know that at least one member has asked a question about long-term trends, and I can go into a little bit more depth about that after the presentation, if that would be helpful. But for both of these areas, we are seeing a positive long-term trend. In particular, the renewable energy generation, two things have contributed significantly to that increase. One is the energy from waste facility at Javelin Park. The other is the installation of photovoltaics and the other energy saving measures that we put in place around the Shire Hall complex and the wider council estate. So really positive improvements in both those areas. Next slide. Highways performance. I'm well aware that this is an area that you'll have heard lots about on the doorstep. As you were canvassing earlier in the year, but actually it's one of the areas that has performed really well during lockdown than over the past year. The indicator that we're looking at here is around the speed of response. When a defect on the roads is reported, it gets assigned a category as either a 2-hour emergency repair, a 24-hour defect, or a 28-day defect, and then we measure the percentage of times that the time target is hit under each of those categories. And you'll see that throughout the whole of last year, we were exceeding targets for all of those. Now, I realise that doesn't always translate into satisfaction on the doorstep, and that's probably an area where there's some debate to be had as to why that might be. But in terms of kind of the speed with which highways engineers are carrying out repairs to those defects, performance has been strong over the last year, having previously, as you've seen, been at a lower level at the end of last year. Next slide. Number of people killed and seriously injured on the council's roads. The reason I'm bringing this to you is because those of you who were around previously, I would have flagged that casualties were quite high in the previously reported quarter, July to September 2020. This is an indicator that fluctuates. It depends on seasonality. It depends, particularly over the last year, on traffic volumes. But it is also subject to a fair degree of randomness. So when it goes above the line, I report it to you, and then when it dips back below, I reassure you that actually it was a once-off blip. So my reason for including this slide is just to close off that issue that I will have raised last time, that actually it had risen for a quarter, but is back below projected levels this quarter. So I think that was just seasonal statistical fluctuation that we can expect to see from time to time. Next slide. And I'm drawing to a close, you'll be pleased to know. Safe and well visits is an area where performance has suffered under lockdown. Obviously, the fire service wasn't able for a period of last year to conduct visits on site. We did see that performance begin to improve towards the latter half of last year, but it remained below our targets and below the level that statistical neighbours had reported. Now, you need to bear in mind that statistical neighbour performance was prior to lockdown, so it doesn't take account of the impact of lockdown on other fire and rescue authorities. Again, with this one, we don't think we're out of kilter with other areas. We think we're going to see, when we get the next benchmarking statistics through, that other areas have taken a similar hit. But we do need to keep an eye on that and make sure that performance improves now that restrictions are beginning to lift. Next one. Another good news story, and this is the dramatic reduction in sickness and absence levels over the past year. And you can see that really has been significant. Sickness absence levels for the previous several years have been pretty well static. But with the change to working from home, with lockdown, you've actually seen quite a dramatic reduction over the past year. We attribute some of that to the fact that people have been less exposed to illness because they haven't been mixing for the reasons we all understand. Some of it is probably also that people that may not have been well enough to come into work or may have been nervous about spreading a cold to the rest of the team, with the advent of more agile ways of working, have been able to continue to work from home and therefore haven't needed to take a day off or several days off sick. So that's a really positive impact of the last year for us. Next one, please. This is an area that falls within my area of responsibility. This graph is looking at official requests for information. Those fall into two categories mainly: freedom of information requests, and you will all know what those are, but also subject access requests. So those are requests that either a member of staff makes or a customer or client of the county council makes to have their records released to them to see what information we're holding about them. Over the past few years, we've seen a gradual increase in the number of subject access requests, typically from children who are either currently in our care or who are care leavers. That was on a steady increase during the first lockdown, and since then it's seen a dramatic rise, and as a result we've struggled to keep up with those requests, and a backlog has arisen. We have brought in additional resources. It's taken time to recruit into those posts and to train people up, but those vacancies are now filled. We've increased the capacity of the team, and in next year's MTFS we'll be looking to address that further. But we haven't yet been able to eliminate that backlog, and as a result our timeliness continues to be off track. We will be trying to bring that back on target over the next year with the introduction of those new resources, and I'll keep you posted in the quarterly reports as to how that's coming on. Finally, a couple of slides about risk. The first one I won't dwell on because the information that it represents is in the following slides, so if we can flick through to that. And what I've given you in this is a synopsis of those risks that are currently rated high on the Council's risk register, but also those risks that have either been increasing or reducing. So we've got one risk that has increased at the end of the year, one which was the failure to deliver the Council's climate change strategy, impacting on reputation. That was an issue of capacity. We've brought in, as some of you will probably already be aware, we've appointed to a joint post with the districts of a climate change coordinator that will provide that extra capacity to lead that climate strategy forward and to begin delivering the actions within that. There have been three risks, conversely, that have reduced. The first was around workforce capacity, impacting on the pace of change and safety, and that risk has reduced. That's a risk that's was primarily around firefighter safety and capability. We've reduced the risk around the impact of service pressures from COVID, particularly in relation to pressure on the budget. And the reason we were able to do that was because, as you know, those costs were covered by several grants from central government that at the moment have been sufficient to address the increased pressure. I suspect that going into this year we'll see a different sort of pressure emerge, which is around the availability of staff due to self-isolation, and you will know better than I that that's a very live debate discussion at the moment. And then the final risk that's reduced is around uncertainties arising from the UK having left the EU and the impact on funding and policy change arising from that, which we felt able to reduce in terms of the likelihood of that risk affecting the Council significantly. So that's it from me. I'm very happy to take any questions that members have got for me.
Thanks, Rob. Ben put a comment up earlier on. Someone somewhere has got a radio playing in the background. It was I could make out the presentation, but there was some background noise. So can we ask again if people are not speaking or not wishing to speak, then please stay on mute. I'm looking for hands. If I can get the participants up. I can see Andrew and Chloe. I'm going to be a gentleman. Ladies first. Chloe.
Hey, Chair. A couple of questions. Start with highways. So, it's great that we're within 95 and 100% on those targets. I saw within the KPIs, though, that nearly half of residents, 48%, are not satisfied with the service. So, bit of a mismatch there. What work are highways doing to sort of understand what's going wrong there? Because, as you say, it's definitely, it's not going well on the doorstep with regard to highways. It takes up most of my inbox, and it's a bit boring. So, any thoughts on that one first?
Yeah, we've got it as a subject coming up at the Environment Scrutiny in September. Andrew, with permission, can I bring Dom in before I bring you in? Because this is very much on the Environment Scrutiny agenda. Dom, are you there?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And I think I'd just add to Councillor Chloe's question there, Rob. I wonder if you could talk me through the methodology for the indicator that you're using to give these highways reports? Because you mentioned risks to reputation in your risk table, and I think you're running a real risk to reputation with the way you're presenting these stats.
Oops.
So there are two types of measures that we're using here. As Chloe's pointed out, there's the National Satisfaction Survey, which is where that 52% figure comes from. The benefit of that measure is that it is comparable. So it's a survey that's taken up across a number of authorities, and so we can see how our performance compares to other areas. And actually, I think the average is 54%, which in terms of the sample size for the survey means that, you know, it's not where we'd want to be, but we're not significantly lower than other areas with similar levels of rurality. You know, not where we'd want to be, but we aren't an outlier at that level of performance. In terms of the speed with which pothole repairs are carried out, those are indicators that are built into the contract we have for that. So they're important from that point of view, and they are, you know, they are a useful guide as to whether the contractor is delivering on the obligations, and that when something is reported, whether it's being picked up on within the required timescale. Of course, what it does miss is those potholes that aren't reported, that nevertheless are a frustration to local residents. So I'd agree with you. I think this is an area where we do need to look closer. I think I welcome the fact that it's an area, if environment are going to look at that, I think that would be really beneficial. Because there clearly is a mismatch between what the data is saying in terms of how quickly potholes are being repaired, and whether that's and translating that into people's experience. It is worth bearing in mind that, you know, I think when you take up a national survey about satisfaction with the roads, residents won't necessarily make the distinction between different types of roads, and they won't make the distinction between roads that are the responsibility of the county council to fix and trunk roads that are the responsibility of Highways England. So that you also need to bear that in mind when interpreting the data.
Yeah, thank you. I know there's something around communication though as well. You know, when you get the response back from Highways, it doesn't really say anything. You know, there's an opportunity to explain some of this stuff, and then perhaps residents' expectations might be different. But...
Yeah.
Thanks, Chloe. Dom, Chloe and Dom both got hands up. There's Andrew. I stopped to bring Dom in, so I'm going to go to Andrew. I've got John, and I've got Stephen. Andrew Miller.
Thank you, Phil. Well, by this time I've got more than one question, so that's the risk of delaying me.
I'll blame myself then. Yeah.
Okay, so the first question, and this is a challenge for officers. There were a couple of those reports under the EI&I which had no January to March 21 data. And I'll give as examples the renewable energy slide and the highways performance slide. So we've talked about doing ourselves credit or otherwise through the presentation of data. But I would have thought that the speed with which we can collect data is also critical. Now, I'm raising this because I've got a sort of professional interest in data and analytics too. But these days, we have more modern IT systems. We have better tools for producing reports. And if we're not using them, we should be. Now, where we're relying on data which is coming in a national data, I can understand because that's outside of council's control. But where we're reliant on systems which are county-based, particularly if they're purely our own services, I don't understand the reason for delay. If they're county-based figures, but we need to rely on other providers of data within the county, we should be improving our partnership arrangements with them. But these days, we should simply, in order to produce a report, officers should essentially be clicking the button to produce new dashboards on our databases, which should be kept up to date. And it should be A, not very time consuming, and B, much more timely than it is at the moment. I would, if data is delayed and it's that length of time between the data and when it's being produced for a meeting, I think I'd like to understand what the reasons are why the data has not been able to be refreshed more quickly, so that we can understand what the data blockers are, or the blockers to presenting it quickly are. So that's the first thing. The second thing was just a comment. I didn't realise that part of the FOI increase was due to care leavers. And just as a comment, and perhaps this is something for Chris Spencer and Children's Services, perhaps we ought to look at providing data to care leavers on a routine basis so that they don't need to submit FOI requests in the first place. Now, I'm sure it'll be a little bit more complicated than that. But for a care leaver to have to submit an FOI to get their records, I think they just shouldn't have to. I mean, this should be provided as a standard. So perhaps we can take that up with Chris Spencer. One of the officers could communicate to him. And I guess thirdly, I think I sympathise with everything that's been said about potholes. Thanks.
Yeah.
Shall I come back on those, Chair?
Yes, and then we if you answer those, then I'll go to John, and I've also got Stephen indicated, not as in Stephen base, as in Stephen member.
Okay. Andrew, firstly, on your point about timeliness of data, I agree with you. We don't have those systems yet, but we are looking at introducing them. So at the moment, we have introduced Power BI dashboards in adult social care and in children's social care, and those will then allow us to begin to draw real-time information into corporate level reporting. But at the moment, those are the only two areas where we've done that. But that is the long-term ambition, and within the next year, we want to work on a corporate module that will essentially sit over those service level modules and suck the data up for this kind of reporting.
Why any children's services and adults? I did know that children's services have been updated. Why not right across the piece? Power BI is a fairly straightforward piece of software. It's self-serve. It's not like you need to have people, you can teach yourself why not right across the council? Why not now across the council? Yeah.
Let him answer.
It is simply a matter of prioritising and resourcing it. You're right, it is a relatively simple tool, but we don't currently have those skills in-house. So we've been reliant on an external provider installing it, developing those prototype dashboards and transferring the knowledge to the internal team. That piece of work is progressing, but has relied on the internal team being able to access the software that enables them to do it. And that's been the hold-up over the last couple of months. So essentially, we've been reliant on an external provider, but we'll be increasingly self-sufficient doing it internally. But that's the plan over the next year to begin to roll that out using our internal data team to do that. You rightly identified that some of this data comes to us via central government, and in particular the data on renewable energy emissions is an example of that. You're more expert on this area than I am, but you'll understand that it goes through calculations and gets reported back to us, and therefore there is usually a quarter's delay in us being able to report it back to you. On the care leavers point, you were absolutely right, and those steps have already been taken. So a good children's services provider will see the provision of all of those records as part of our care leavers offer and part of our therapeutic response to children who are leaving care. And that is now the case. That offer has been set out clearly and includes making sure that at the point at which care leavers leave our care, that information is shared with them. that in part is the reason why we're seeing a peak in demand at the moment, though, because of course one of the consequences of making it part of the care offer is that those who left care before that offer was made realise that it's something they're entitled to and haven't had, and that's partly what's driving the peak in demand. But colleagues in children's services have been working with us really closely and have been really helpful in terms of recognising that this is first and foremost a care leavers issue, and second a subject access request issue, and in dealing with it appropriately.
I'm going on to John. Chloe, your hand is still raised. Are you looking to come back in at some point? Okay, leave your hand up. I'll come back to you. John Bloxham.
Yeah, I had a question, a couple of observations. So in terms of the stats around children's services, can someone confirm that the Children's Services Improvement Board has sight of those and has ownership of driving performance management in relation to those? That would be helpful to have that confirmation. I had an observation around the renewable energy statistics. So I'd like the Environment Scrutiny Committee to have a look at this, because my understanding is that we're counting this in a particular way. So we're counting energy that is generated. What we're not necessarily counting is the energy that is used, so fossil fuel consumption, to generate the energy that is then exported. So I'm not sure that that's a proper measure of the net position. So I think Environment Scrutiny ought to have a look at that issue. And in terms of highways, I agree with the comment about presentation. I think that box, which has highways in the success category, would be extremely surprising to most residents who perceive that we have a relatively poor performance. Certainly the comparators, from my observation and the observation of other people, those comparators would suggest that we are indeed an outlier. I think the measure is speed of response in terms of repairs. I'm not sure that's a very meaningful measure. I mean, if you think of your own house, for example, you might be able to get a leak fixed quickly, but that doesn't mean there isn't an underlying problem. So, you know, for roads, the issues would be around what's the underlying condition of the road, what's the durability of a repair, how many repeat repairs do we have? And we seem to have a culture where there is a communications problem. And my perception from my obviously limited service at this point in time is there is an expectation that if you want to get a repair done, you backdoor via your councillor, and that's the way you lobby to get something done. And actually the highways local budgets in a way maybe reinforce that perception or expectation. So members act as a kind of sponge for taking on board this pressure from residents and trying to filter things through to officers, and that to get into that bind is not a good place to be. And I think we ought to be kind of having a look at that process and how we can try and address that. And I do think there are deficiencies relative to other authority areas, but happy to look at that comparative experience. Thank you.
Yeah, as I said earlier, I know it's a priority in environment scrutiny for September. It's certainly well on Dom's agenda, as he's already made a few points. That I'm still trying to be a gentleman, Stephen. I know you're waiting, but I'm going to go back to Chloe, because I am keen that we do have non-chairs of scrutiny committees, and I do want to hear all the way through the comments from those that aren't chairs of scrutiny committees. So I'm going to Chloe first, and I'll go to Steve. Okay.
Thank you, Chair. I'm trying to be quick, but I am going to get on my soapbox, I'm afraid. I wanted to just talk briefly about the climate change strategy risk. You know, climate change is clearly here and it's huge. In my lifetime, we've lost half the invertebrates on the planet and 40 million birds from the skies. And, you know, what's happened in the last few weeks is coming harder and faster. We've got, floods across Central Europe, Siberia's on fire, the Amazon's just been announced as a net CO2 emitter, and we've had our first extreme heat warning ever in the UK this week. So the fact that the council's strategy has moved to a probable fail state is extremely concerning to me. We already knew about the climate engagement officer being on board, so I'm not sure why the risk is still probable if she's going to solve it. And the addition of 2 graduates is frankly not making me feel any warmer about it. So I'm really concerned that it's failing, even more so that it's not considered enough of a priority that it made it to the main dashboard that we've looked at. But perhaps what I'm most upset about is the fact that and this made me actually feel really ashamed to be part of Gloucestershire County Council when I read this, the fact that the risk that's been identified is not the risk to the climate, it's not the risk to Gloucestershire, it's not the risk to our natural environment or our infrastructure or our communities, it's the risk to the council's reputation. And I'd really love somebody to explain to me why that's considered acceptable. Thank you.
Thanks, Chloe. I should have anticipated that, shouldn't I? But yeah, Rob, it's still your and it did raise its head in environment last week as well, from memory, did it not, Don? Yeah, Rob. Try to
Yeah,
give
no problem.
assurance.
Sorry, could you repeat that? You cut out just then, Phil.
Yeah, I was saying, could you give Chloe a little bit of assurance? It did raise its head at environment scrutiny last week, but yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right, Chloe. On retrospect, it's a badly worded risk, and I think we should reword it. And I'm happy to take that away. I think the impact on the council's reputation is secondary, and shouldn't be the focus of the risk. I think in terms of where we are with the climate strategy, that's a piece of work that's ongoing at the moment and that's being looked at. It's not one that I'm involved in directly, so I can't really update you. But in terms of why the mitigation of having the climate change champion in play, climate change coordinator in place, isn't reflected, it's simply a matter of the timing. So this was the position as reported at the end of the year. And the person has come into post since, but I realise there's a bigger point you're making here, and it's one that I'm sure will be taken forward in discussions as we look at that climate change strategy going forward, and I'll certainly feed it back into CLT as well. If I can pick up John's questions as well, because there were a couple of those that he asked me. Yeah. John, I can confirm that all of those measures and many, many more are reported into the improvement board. My team produces, would you believe it, a monthly 90-page report that includes all of these and a great deal more information that both goes to the improvement board and to Children's and Family Scrutiny. So those are looked over closely in a number of environments. Renewable energy stats, I'll have to refer to the experts on that one. But I think they've been if I remember correctly, there've been council questions on this in the past, and the answers have confirmed that we are using a nationally prescribed methodology for measuring that. But as I say, I'm not the expert. I'll need to look into that. And I think in terms of highways, there is an indicator for underlying condition of the roads network. I haven't looked at it recently, but when I did last look at it, it was another of those where we were very much in the pack, that the condition of the county's roads wasn't out of kilter with other areas similar to us, so areas with a high rural population. That's not the reason we don't report it here. The reason I don't tend to report it on a quarterly basis is that we only get that data annually, and therefore it isn't really much use in terms of being able to track performance on a quarter-by-quarter basis. But it is available should you want it. I think your point about repeat repairs is an interesting one. I don't know whether we can get that data, but it's a helpful suggestion, and I'll ask the question of colleagues in highways.
Thank you. He's been very patient, so I'm going to go to Stephen next, but and I see Don's indicated again. Yeah, okay.
Thanks, Bill. just like to been wondering whether to ask this question and comment or not. We see lots and lots of statistics at every corporate overview and scrutiny meeting, but we never really seem to catch the worm and really go into why. We're happy to look at the numbers, but we're very reticent to ask, well, why is this so? But more importantly, what are we doing about things? Now, is that a fair criticism? Is it a fair comment? Too many numbers, not enough reasoning. And the second one I've got is, this is really, does annoy me sometimes. Remember, guys, we are all part of the county council team. And therefore, there shouldn't be any us and them. We're all in it together. So what I don't like to hear is, well, they say this or they say that. It's we say this and we say that. And perhaps it will herald a time when we all take fair responsibility for what the county council does and we try and get things better. Thank you.
I think that's the intention of this corporate scrutiny, this corporate scrutiny committee, and it's certainly the ambition. We are all in it together. I've heard that a few times in my lifetime. I seem to remember somebody using it, but yeah, I don't know whether Rob, did you want to respond to Steve's plea?
I think it's one of the challenges of this committee, in that it's generally the role of the other scrutiny committees to get into the depth of the detail. I think this committee's role is to try and take a broad overview of corporate performance. I'll take on the chin the point about stats, but that kind of is the game I'm in. So that is the dimension you're going to get from me presenting it. You know, that's the nature of the beast. But equally, I hope when I give the presentation, I do try and illustrate some of the story behind the stats. But we can only cover so much, and the stats will inevitably be my starting point. If there are areas, and we've already talked about this under work planning, if there are areas within the committee's remit where a deeper dive and a different way into the performance would be useful, then absolutely it's within the committee's gift to identify that and to request it, and we'll bring a different sort of report in response to that. But this really is a stats-driven presentation, and will always be to some extent. I don't know if Steve's got his hand up. I don't know if you wanted to add to that, Steve.
If he's going to add to that point, then yes.
Yeah, it is on that point, Chair. And I think all I would say in terms of when members, if they pick up an issue and they want to run with it in the relative subcommittee or the relative more detailed committee, I think that's the point when you say, okay, so it was 98%, but 98% of what? Is it 3,000 inquiries? Is it 30,000 inquiries? Is it 30 inquiries? And I think that's the point to go into the greater level of detail to understand the context, how many customers, how many residents, how many people, etc., are affected by that percentage stat. And that's what we often do when we're drilling into more detailed level, is we understand the number, because that also then gives you a context of how difficult or easy it is to correct. You know, if you're talking about 2% of 300,000 queries or context, that's quite hard to correct. Whereas if you're talking about 2% of 30 queries, that's a lot easier to correct.
Yeah, it's a fair point. It's a fair point. Dom.
Thanks, Phil. And just to Stephen's point about working together, Chloe, with regards to your point, I completely understand your position. We had a long conversation about this on the Environment Scrutiny Committee. I think one of the really useful things about risk and having it front and centre in Rob's presentation is that it does stimulate these conversations. Rob, I wouldn't want to do Colin's homework for him, but my sense is that the driver of the risk in climate change is not having GCC staffing capacity. So if and when you do refine that risk, I think that's probably the centre of gravity on that. With regards to the evidence-based point on highways, I think the biggest challenge here is accessibility of the baseline. It's taken me 4 meetings with the highways team to get anywhere near a baseline of my roads across Fairford, Lechlade, and the villages, and even sitting down, going through and interrogating the software. Some of the baseline stuff is, well, actually the baseline is only reassessed every 2 years. So I really do think that there is not a very sexy indicators conversation to be had around highways, so that we can all come together and get this moving more positively. And then the final one is a question, actually, Rob. I was really interested in the stats you used for staff performance at GCC, and also felt I kind of wish there was a stat in there about responses to councillors, because my sense is that for whatever reason, response rates are quite slow, and there doesn't seem to be a measurement there of staff inputs either in time or outputs either in terms of projects with regards to servicing councillors' requests. And I'm conscious that we've come out of a very difficult period for the team, working environment, family, and all that sort of stuff. And I suppose in a corporate responsibility, I'd like a more fuller sense of how hot the team are running. Sickness is one indicator, but it's quite difficult to disaggregate between COVID sickness, other sickness, mental health, and everything else. And I came away with a bit of an itch still in terms of our responsibility to the staff and the team, and understanding A, how they're running, B, if things aren't quite right, and if there's anything we could do about it. Thanks.
Dom, I'm not sure whether your question was relating specifically to highway staff, or whether you're thinking more generally across the council. But
forgive me all the way across, Rob. Apologies, I wasn't clear. Thank you.
No, that's all right. That's great. So the challenge there is we don't have a single system that captures customer responsiveness or indeed councillor responsiveness. It's very much service based, and different services will capture that information in different ways. It makes it really hard to construct a county-wide view. But I think we recognise that that's a gap, and one that we need to be looking at. So there's a piece of work that's beginning at the moment, looking at customer experience, looking at what it feels like to be a customer of GCC, and bluntly whether we do have sufficient sight of what that customer experience is like. So I think that's an area you'll see some progress on over the coming year. But in the meantime, there's no data that I can share with you, and it is a bit of a gap.
Okay. I'm looking at hands up. I've got a question myself, obviously. Yeah, I see Steve's
Chair.
Yeah.
Just on that one, and I think it's a good point that Councillor Morris raises on productivity. I guess is what we're actually talking about in some of that activity. Rob's right. We're looking at the customer stuff as well, and we generally don't have an easy, sufficient measure on staff productivity. We don't produce widgets on a assembly line, so it's quite hard to measure. But we are looking at it. It's something that Lyndon Stowe has asked us to do some consideration on, and in particular where there are problems, where there are issues, where there are either a glut of backlog of issues that we've got that are not being dealt with. So I think the productivity matter is something that we will want to have a discussion going forward on corporately once we've done a bit more work, and probably once we're in a bit more normal state, actually, because we need to see where we come out of this over the next 6 or 12 months, kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think Mandy's coming in on a similar point. I think I'll try and read her.
Yeah, with my HR hat on, I mean the team running hot thing. That, it's a really complex area. However, there is a sort of whole range of work that we are doing around health and wellbeing with workforce, and a series of our employee engagement survey, which takes a temperature, if you like, around a whole range of issues in terms of how staff are feeling, including their sort of productivity and how busy they are. And we're following up very shortly around with a pulse survey that specifically tackles some of the wellbeing stuff, agile, post-COVID. So there is information available in those types of areas, so we could take that away and have a think about how we present it.
Thank you. There's no other hands up, so I'm going to ask my question. And since we've been going an hour and a half, after I ask my question and Rob's finished his presentation, I'm going to offer members a 5-minute comfort break because we'll have been sat down for an hour and a half. Rob, this raised its head environment scrutiny last week. It's in your risks. I'm bound to mention it because being a nerd, I sit through a fair few planning, should we say, inspectors, and this relates to SIL. I noticed the minute from the March meeting, as I said earlier on, where the issue then seems to be, should we say, minor. It's not minor now with the districts. I did ask a bit of a rhetorical question last week, as I bet the districts won't tell us what they're sat on, but it's got to be considerable. Just how exposed are we? Because I think potentially in relation to school provision, it's millions. Are you prepared to answer?
I can't answer for that because I don't know the answer, and I wouldn't want to mislead you. But I think we said this is an area that either environment scrutiny would be asked to look at, or maybe even received a report on in the past that we could circulate. But I'll get you a written answer to that, unless any of my colleagues around the table know the answer. No.
We've got the chair of environment scrutiny here. He's got a big smile on his face because I think he recalls the debate that we had last week. But
right,
I'm just thinking of my backlog, Chair, just getting bigger and bigger.
But it's not just funding for schools; it's some of the infrastructure things as well. And I think, luckily I'm not a district councillor any longer, but it would be interesting to know just how much is being held around the districts. I think Stroud, we were told, were the only district that's ever paid anything in. All the rest are just sitting on it. Okay, no other questions? Don, or was that just to say no question?
Yeah, Phil, thank you. Small thing, but big thing. And methodologically, I think, sorry, my day job is risk in war zones. There's a useful distinction to be made between risks and issues. Risks being there's a hole in the road and you might fall in it. An issue being I've fallen in it, how can I get out of it? And I appreciate it's a small thing, but the IT system is making everybody's life really, really difficult. And I don't know whether it's useful to classify that as a risk now, sorry, as an issue now, rather than a risk in that I feel like I'm in the hole and I can't manage my diary and I can't sync it with the rest of my day job. I'm sure other colleagues are having exactly the same thing. We don't have a storage system and. I don't know whether this is the right forum to raise this, but it feels to me that this is an issue that's now rather than a risk in the future.
Chair, I have to cover that under my update, if that's okay.
Yeah. Okay. With that, 11:33. I'm going to say be back here at. Let's be fair. 11:40. It'll allow time for making a coffee and anything else. Okay. See you in 7 minutes. Okay. How many have we got back? I'm waiting for screens to go back up. It's important on a hot day. In my case, it's to get my 3rd litre of water down. I don't. If anybody follows my Facebook, I'm not always on gin and tonic. It's usually water. Have we got everyone? Some are like Ben. In fairness, Ben was struggling with, and I see Ben's back up now. But you were listening to everything through anyway, weren't you, Ben? You just took your screen down for.
Yeah,
for
I think
audio.
I think sometimes when it's a bit jittery, I think turning the video off helps a bit. I think it's probably to do with my broadband connection, but yes, I was hanging on your every word, Chair.
Yeah, I bet. I'm just looking for others. Can others confirm that they're at least in on audio? I'm looking for Matt, Lisa, Andrew.
Yeah, I'm here. Yep.
Thanks, Andrew.
That's cool. Just wanted to prove I've still got a voice as well. I appreciate I've been quite quiet this morning.
Yeah, I thought it was quite refreshing. Yeah, thanks. I'm bound to have a bit of banter.
Pretty called for, Chair. Thank you very much. I'll make sure I correct that if that's what you think.
No doubt you'll get your own back.
Okay. I'm not going to do that, don't worry.
Yeah. Lisa's back in. Matt, if you can just confirm. No. Okay. Well, we're going to push on. It's 11:43. So we're on to item 6, which is page 53 to 56, and this is Steve's where he'll pick up, no doubt, some of the issues that come out in the earlier piece. Steve.
Thanks, Chair. And I've also got Rob, Mandy, and Paul here as well for any further detailed questions. I mean, hopefully the report is fairly self-explanatory in terms of the areas. I think it's worth bearing in mind that corporate resources kind of maintains 2 or 3 main roles. Obviously, on quite a lot of this performance, we are the bastion of the reports and the data for the council-wide position. So particularly on HR and thickness and on PDRs and on staff turnover, we are the kind of the bastion of the data for everybody else. So I'm happy to take questions or comments on that. There are a few services that clearly we provide for the rest of the council, and asset and property management is one of those, which clearly has an impact then on the funding of the capital programme. And obviously the other one is IT services. So I'm just going to spend a few moments talking about IT, if that's okay. I think it's worth remembering throughout 2019 and 2020 the massive change that we've seen in the requirement for working at home, and effectively what I would call 3 years in 3 weeks transformation that we saw back in early March 2020. And the recognition that in many of that respects, we effectively threw in software. I mean, I think I was talking to a specialist about this, and that their analogy was it was called throwing it over the fence software deployment, which is not by any measure what we wanted to do. So we recognize that a lot of home working activity, as you know, so the Jabber software that we use, WebEx that we use, was effectively just done very quick and dirty, and not where we wanted to be at all. I think the other challenge that we've had is we've parted company with our long-term IT provider, Sopra Steria, and it wasn't until we actually really parted company that we just got a real feel for the state of play under the council bonnet of an infrastructure system, if you like, that we actually started to understand just how complex and detailed the service actually was. And the team that have been working on this, the new management team, so we brought some services back in-house, which is the core frontline service. We're operating with a new strategic partner with a company called Cantium, which is County Council's wholly owned IT company. And that's for our more complex, what they call enterprise solutions, kind of second level inquiries, running of our servers, etc. And also we've been working directly with some external partners that we used to work through SOPRA with. So in particular, the network and infrastructure work that we've now employed BT Direct. So BT to work with us directly on the infrastructure, both in our buildings and across our buildings and across the networks. So we've been dealing with people change, we've been dealing with network change, and a hell of a lot of system change. The good news is that we think we now understand the network much clearer. The bad news is it's not an overnight switch to make those changes, and we will see some changes taking place over the next 2 months, other changes taking place probably up to the end of the calendar year. And in particular for members, and I know I've been saying this for quite some time, I think I started saying this as soon as I arrived actually in August 2019, the removal of a number of software matters, in particular BlackBerry works, or BlackBerry doesn't work for most of us, which is ironic in terms of its naming, and move to Office 365 for all of us, or move to 365, which it will include deployment to mobile devices as well, and a much more integrated activity on mobile devices. I understand from Simon that there are also some, in terms of Councillor Morris's question about access to storage, we can enable that on BlackBerry. It's a bit clunky and it's a bit easy, not very easy to do, but we can enable it, and Simon will be in touch to allow some of that to take place, for particularly for new members. But as those of you that have worked with 365 will know, it is much more integrated across a range of activities, both your hardware, both your software, so devices that you've got, either your mobile devices or iPads and other devices, and laptops and PCs and all that kind of stuff. So we will be deploying that later this year, hopefully, as long as we get through, because we need to do the network first stuff first, and then we can move on to the software and rollout of Teams and all that. I think the other bit of that is, once we've got the systems and hardware updated, it is how we manage that data flow and information. And I have expressed the view to my colleagues that we've over complicated our rollout of some of the systems and technology use in the past, and in particular things like, if we say to someone, well, you shouldn't transfer data from one system to another. Well, not only have we said you shouldn't do it, we've actually just stopped you doing it and turned it off. And there's a difference between helping everybody to understand the risks and the problems with, doing a big payroll download from the payroll system and then putting that on an email and sharing that wider. You shouldn't do. But actually, how do we do the advice bit as well as the system bit, and still allow some level of functionality? And I think we've gone too far the other way. I think we've, as a council, we've gone too far in terms of turning things off. That actually means we've lost a lot of functionality, not just for members, but the whole council. So I think that's my challenge when we deploy the next set of software, is to make sure that it's tested and that it's functional for all its users, and that we get the full functionality of 365, not just a little bit of, well, we can use an email system slightly better, etc., or use Teams slightly better. So we're on that route map. We're on that kind of road, if you like, with our new partner, and also the rollout of new things like Microsoft 365 partner and the rollout of that technology. So happy to take questions on that. I'm just going to finish off a couple of bit of my updates, if that's okay. Strategic finance, I think the comments in there are relevant to the outturn report, and obviously Paul will do a quick update on the position that we reported to Cabinet yesterday. We know that we've got pressures in the SHE team, and in particular a bit of the backlog that we've been happening as a result of COVID. And then Rob's already mentioned the issues that we've got in information management team as well. So that's the stuff that's at paragraph 11. So I'm just going to pause there, Chair, and happy to take questions either on the stuff that we've mentioned there, or if there's some other area that fits under corporate resources that members wanted to ask questions on.
Thanks, Steve. First in, Chloe.
Yeah, on the governance point, the 4 cases that went to the Ombudsman, I just wondered, is that a normal amount? Is that sort of what we'd expect in a normal year. There wasn't a comparator, and I just yeah, just an idea of whether that's normal.
It's lower than we would normally expect, Chloe. So average is somewhere about 2 a quarter, so 8 over the course of a year. But the LGO's office did shut down for the entirety of the first lockdown, so that means this hasn't been a typical year. But generally, our performance is better than average for that indicator. We do normally see a very low number. And I look at each one that comes in that's been upheld just for any patterns or recurring issues. With such few coming in, it's difficult to spot any patterns, but I've never been concerned that there are any kind of entrenched issues that aren't being addressed. They tend to be isolated cases that have gone wrong for various reasons.
Okay, lovely, thank you. And my second point, I was going to ask you, Steve, if you could sort of summarise what the AMP strategy is, but I've just found it online and I've had to look at it now. It's very clear that it's all about sort of economic opportunities, commercial return, etc. And I just wondered whether, I think it's revisited annually, isn't it? Whether perhaps the next time it was revisited, it could be viewed through our climate strategy lens as well as the existing priorities, because there's and that might account for why we have, you know, a lot of interest around the rural estate. Is, you know, it might be easier to look at it in that context if it was already framed in the AMP strategy that we should have a sustainability focus as well. So yeah, thanks.
Happy to look at that.
Dom.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. And Steve, really grateful for that IT update. Sounds like an extraordinary journey you've been on. Just a couple of quite boring, important questions. Will we be able to integrate our email? Sorry, and the context of this is I can't remember the stats, but there's an extraordinary number of new councillors in GCC, and most of us are either self-employed or have other day jobs and other laptops. And the key thing for me, and I hope I speak for others, is integration into our existing world, and that means having our GCC emails on our normal everyday outlooks and having calendars that integrate. And I'm just looking for a bit of reassurance that that's going to be possible. And just to head it off, we can't hide behind the security classification thing, because I've had official sensitive email addresses plumbed into my existing laptop. So just a question on integration and functionality, because new councillor intake have got really busy lives and we've got to find a way of integrating. Thank you.
I don't know if Mandy wants us to. I saw a finger waving. I don't know if you. I mean, I know we know it's a pressure, and I don't know if colleagues know, but I'm also a squadron leader with the Royal Air Force Air Cadets, so I get exactly the same sort of issue, and we have to operate separate systems in some categories, but can access some stuff collectively. So you can access the email on your device, but you can't actually integrate the calendars easily. So I think, again, we are listening to that. I think it affects councillors probably more than it does other officers, because we don't see the integration generally with other workers. They want to keep that. Actually, they want us to keep stuff separately as much as possible and some stuff. But we are also conscious of the BYOD stuff. Bring your own device, which is where we'll look at the integration, I think, best. But we're happy to pick that up.
Mandy.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, so we have put together a sort of spec of assumptions, and it is assumptions at this stage in terms of the ask from members for the 365 rollout. We are restarting, there was a sort of members, I can't remember the name of it, but a members sort of ICT group, very operational, what do members need to support them. So I want to test those assumptions, but I have given those assumptions to the project team and saying these are the basic asks. This is what I'm expecting us to be able to deploy. So we're working on that literally as we speak. And I'm going to put myself out there, so don't hold me to this. The task I've set is that we aim for the deployment between September and December. Of the basic tool set. So let me come back on it. But that's the challenge I've given, absolutely, is that integration and the bring your own stuff.
Thanks, Mandy. You're not on screen, but I did pick you up in chat, Ben. Did you? I saw your comment to Dom. Is there anything on that you want to?
No, just thoroughly endorse what he said. I have a day job, and just absolutely, you know, the work-life balance. It sometimes feels like the IT sort of works against us. So just really endorsing what he said, and yeah, it sounds really good, and grateful for officers for, you know, tackling what's obvious. It's an obvious problem, but it's, you know, it's very necessary.
Thanks, Ben. Anyone else? I'm seeing no hands. No. Thank you, Steve. Nothing you want to add before I move on to Paul then? No?
No, I'm okay. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Welcome, Paul.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
We're on to you. What is it? Pages 57 to 68 on the papers.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Chair. As Steve mentioned, this is the report that went to Cabinet yesterday, so it shows the financial position as in period 2 at the end of May. So this is, you know, it continues to be an unusual year with COVID and non-COVID. So we try and split it between non-COVID and then the exceptional circumstances of COVID. So I'll start with the kind of non-COVID, the business as usual position. So currently we're forecasting an overspend of just over 4.5 million on a 483 million budget. So although it's a big figure, 4.5 million, it's under 1%, and you will get those variations. So it's kind of 4.5 million sounds a lot, but it is something that officers are working on, and it's a forecast at this stage. So we have got a good reputation for those new councillors of actually managing within our budget at the year-end position. So it is a forecast at this stage on the revenue budget, but officers are working on containing that. Having said that, the largest forecast variance is in with children and families, and non-COVID is currently a forecast of 6.5 million. The most significant issue within that is the external placements budget. Both the numbers of external placements and the unit cost due to the complexity of cases has gone up. Some of this is related to COVID, but if you track it over the last 3 to 4 years, it is a continuous upward slope, both in numbers and unit costs. And that trajectory hasn't been significantly changed due to COVID. So that's, you know, the most significant issue really on the financial side. That 6.5 million overspend is slightly offset by one in technical and county-wide. There's a 800,000 positive interest balance that we're forecasting. You know, as you all know, interest rates are really low, but we've managed to lock ourselves into some good long-term deals where we don't need the money. So we're getting a reasonably good interest rate. But obviously, if interest rates, you know, continue to stay as they are, that won't be a long-term gain. But we're forecasting that this year we'll get about £800,000 more than we've got in the budget. And also at the start of the year, when we set the budget, we create some savings. We can't always achieve those, so we have a little contingency set aside. Currently, it looks like we're going to achieve all the 7 million of savings, so that 1.2 million savings contingency could be released. So within Corp and Tech, there's a underlying underspend of 2 million, which comes to roughly the 4.5 million overspend that we're forecasting on the revenue side. So that's kind of the non-COVID. If you then move to look at the COVID position, obviously we've still got the financial implications of COVID, and they're continuing into the new financial year. The government has allocated an additional grant of 11.5 million for COVID emergency grant that we can spend relatively as we want on COVID-related issues. And we've also got 11 million from last year's that we carried forward. So we've got, you know, roughly 22 million worth of COVID money that we can spend. In addition to that, there's been some ring-fenced grants. Some of those were unspent last year and been carried forward. And then we've got some new allocations this year. So another 26 million of that. So looking at our forecast for COVID, we're pretty confident that we can stick within that in the current financial year. The real problem is going to be next year when the government has made the next financial year when the government made clear that we won't be getting any new COVID money, but you know the likelihood is that a lot of the impacts of COVID will continue into the new financial year. But we won't know anything about how much money we're going to get for that, if anything, until the comprehensive spending review, which is going to be in the autumn, and that will give us some idea of what we're going to get in the medium term. The government has implied that it will be a 4-year funding settlement, which will be great because that will give us some certainty about how much money we're going to get. So that's on the kind of the revenue side, the day-to-day expenditure. On the capital side, it's early in the financial year, so we're still reporting that we're on track. There's no slippage, and that all the projects are progressing. One change we have made is when we did a lot of the planning, we weren't on the IT side. We weren't sure whether it was actually going to be us buying software or whether it's going to be software in the cloud. But obviously, we're moving now with our ITC strategy towards software in the cloud. So we've actually reduced the capital program because we won't actually be owning anything. We'll be buying products on the cloud. And so we're still buying those things. We're still implementing them. It just won't be capital anymore. It'll be day-to-day revenue. So we just have to play around with how we finance the budgets to ensure that we can afford the revenue rather than the ongoing capital costs. So that's a kind of a quick summary, but happy to take any more detailed questions. Thanks very much, Chair.
Thanks, Paul. I'm looking to members. Any hands? No?
Yeah, my hand's up, Chair.
Well done, Ben. Thank you.
It's a question around the Children's Services budget. I asked a question at budget setting of the cabinet member about the realism of the Children's Services budget because, and I haven't got the figures in front of me, but at the time I was raising that every year there's an overspend. Now, I'm not against spending that money. Let me make that clear. I don't think any of us are. It's more to do with how that budget is set and how it comes as a surprise. I think it's 4 years in a row now. It seems to come as a surprise every year. And whether, and certainly the previous 3 years, I hear what you're saying around costs, but the previous 3 years, the reason given for that was that the council was surprised by the number of children coming into care. Once is a surprise, maybe twice is a surprise. Once you get into the 3rd year and the 4th year. So I guess the questions around planning and planning for that realistically and the process that's gone through so that, you know, to state the obvious, that we're not again in this situation next year and the following year and every year going forward. I think also if I was an officer, certainly a senior officer, of course we need to make sure that they're sticking to budgets that they've got. But if it's under budget every year, that does bring a pressure on them. That if the budget isn't realistic, in terms of sort of having to come back cap in hand, as it were. And I think that could be really difficult for officers. So anyway, it's a question about planning mainly.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I'll kind of start there. I guess, you know, we do obviously go to Children's Services and ask them to forecast. Someone sneezed, I think. Forecast the demand, and obviously, the past isn't always an indication of what's going to happen in the future. We get the best data we can, and we do base that. And we added 3.5 million in the budget for external placements, but demand has continued to go up higher than in the predictions that we had got from officers within Children's Services. So it's not a matter of us necessarily, you know, reducing the budget so it doesn't, you know, to make ends meet. You know, we do base it on the best available statistics we can, and we do try other initiatives such as those councils involved with Travone House, where we try and reduce external placement costs by doing some in-house provision. It's a notoriously difficult area to predict. Numbers, sometimes we get them under trajectory, but what's really caught us, I think, is the unit cost has increased quite significantly and more than we forecast. So you're right, you know, we do need to, you know, get better at this because clearly we're not brilliant at forecasting the demand for external placements. You know, we base it on the best data we can and we do set the budget accordingly. But unfortunately, as you say, in the last 3 to 4 years, that planning, you know, hasn't been sufficient to accurately forecast the demand. I think Steve Mawson's also indicating, so I'll let him go as well.
I think there's there's a challenge in trying to work out what's a local issue and local predictability, and then what's either regional or national. Sitting here in kind of February, we'd seen a big increase in kind of the previous April, May, and then actually the numbers had leveled off. So actually, if you remember at the kind of final outturn position, we were actually marginally under where we'd said we would be at the beginning of the year. And I was hoping, and myself and Paul meet with Chris and his management team on a monthly basis, and I was hoping that was we were getting near that final leveling off position. And certainly when we did the budget setting and when we did the monitoring report on the outturn, that looks the case. I have to say I was a bit shocked and surprised when we saw the first figures that how much they'd actually gone up. Now that is, I am told that is based on the placement availability. There's been a real change in the market since about April. There's been a real shift in the market, and Paul is right that we have now got an extra effort to create more local placements, and some of the report that went to Cabinet yesterday on the contract, if you like, to put that local placement in place. So that's the provider side of it, if you like, and we will also be looking from a property perspective on which properties we can recirculate and reuse to make sure that we've got the buildings available. And there's about 3 or 4 that are in the offing once we've had a bit more look in the detail, some of which were mentioned in the capital report that went to the budget as well. I think it's a measure of also in terms of our own position in terms of where we're at on children's services. Are we controlling demand? Are we reviewing cases? And some of the stuff that Rob was talking about earlier. I think throughout last year, we were also fairly comforted that and I'm sure Scrutiny members that were here last year remember this, that we'd been able to maintain face-to-face visits in many circumstances with our children that were already in care. And that was giving me some reassurance that it shouldn't jump again. But we have seen that jump. We are concerned about it. I think it's some of it is a surprise because and some of it isn't. So what you don't see inside those numbers is there is actually, as Paul said, 4 million have already planned, that some of which we will allocate. So let's say the number of children that we have in care didn't change from here to the year end, then actually we would see some of that balancing off because we've already got some growth already allocated. What we're saying here is based on the April-May figures, that kind of indicates that the numbers are going to start to grow even more than we budgeted for. They may not, and we may have a control of demand, and we may be able to bring that number down a little bit. But I think what we're trying to do with these projections is give members an early indication that projection is looking like it will get to, by the year end, greater than we had anticipated at the budget setting, which, remember, those discussions, and we're starting some of those discussions now, primarily take place in September, October. So you do have to do a projection and another work. And I just wanted to do one other piece. One of the things that we're going to do, that we're doing slightly different this year, is also getting services to concentrate on the 3-year picture or the 4-year picture actually going forward. So that we can start to align the national intentions on funding with what that looks like from a service perspective. My worry for next year, budget setting wise, is as COVID ends, we will start to see some spike in demands and expectations actually all across the patch from our residents, from our customers, right across the business. And there will be a challenge for us to try and control that from a financial perspective, but also from a demand management perspective in our service areas. We haven't seen that yet, other than a little bit in children's social, quite a sizable area in children's social care.
Can I comment, Chad, on that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
I mean, I fully appreciate the complexities involved in it, and also the difficulty in predicting. And I think in terms of strategy, I think the strategy is right in terms of bringing stuff into the county and providing that here. I think the long term that is right. I still haven't got away from, and bearing in mind, I fully appreciate, and it's a good answer from both of you. So thanks very much for it. I do understand the complexities. However, it is clear that we haven't quite got it right consistently, and so I I don't know what to suggest really, but just that.
Well, I guess it's worth considering the alternative for a moment, isn't it? The alternative is that you set up a contingency budget with a further 10 to 15 million of growth. And actually, what the impact of that would be a further 10 to 15 million pounds worth of savings that you would put on services. And the challenge, both the executive, all members when it comes to Budget Council, is whether you're willing to live with that pain in other services on the possibility of a contingency that's needed. And that's the risk, is that we don't think, and I, the position did change a little bit, to be fair. When I was sat in front of the budget setting, I would say some contingency would be needed. And if you look at the risk assessment of reserves, which is what I would point to at budget setting time, we did point to there might be some growth that isn't predicted. And if an overspend happens at year end, that's where we will take the money from. So I wouldn't say that it wasn't predicted, because we set a budget, and remember that's a base budget, but we do say there may be some volatility, and that's our risk assessment of reserves. So there is some money built in. I can't remember the figure off the top of my head, but I think it was 3 million for all services that we said, actually, we might need to come and claw back from reserves if it doesn't happen. So that's where we normally would deal with the in-year. And like Paul said, this is the figures as we were at the end of May, and officers will be working through that. And as my concern is, what else is going to come out of the woodwork as we come out of COVID and other service areas? So I think it's a little unfair to say we didn't say at all that there might be an overspend, because that's what we do as our risk assessment of reserves. But actually, it's probably slightly higher at this stage than we would have liked it to be when we were setting the budget in February.
Okay. Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Ben. Because it's your area of scrutiny, Andrew, you've indicated, and then I'm going to go to Chloe and John. Andrew.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. So I was going to make a very, very similar point to the one that Ben made. I think the situation that we're in is that we have the double whammy of an increase in children in the care system and an increase in cost, particularly in the high cost placements. And I think during COVID, it was extremely difficult to get high needs placements. The availability in some cases just wasn't there, and that led to some really bad situations. Look, my view is that with COVID, we've had to put extra, and your providers have had to make additional preparations, additional precautions, all of which have been pushing up the cost of these placements. And it's not clear to me that that cost is going to go down in future either, since I suspect that COVID precautions are going to be required for some time to come. So I do think when we're doing this forecasting process, we have to take a very prudent view. This isn't a situation where we can control costs in the short term. We can only control demand in the much longer term, or make better provision in the much longer term. In the shorter term, we don't have any control mechanisms because it's a demand-led service. So I would just urge officers to be quite prudent in their forecasting around children's services, because of the continued likelihood of increased numbers and increased unit costs. But I think to some extent Steve has mostly answered the questions that I had. Just a further plea for prudence in the forecasting process.
Thanks, Andrew. Chloe.
Thank you. Hi, Steve. I had a question about the outturn for technical and countrywide. And it's partly because I don't quite understand what that category is. Is it a sort of slush fund for, or is it a sort of specific category of expenditure? But my particular question is in relation to paragraph 38. I just don't quite understand what that's saying. What is that underspend about? Would you mind just clarifying?
I'll take that, Steve.
Yeah, happy to cover it, Paul, if you want. Go ahead.
Yeah. So just quickly go into paragraph 38. That's basically that each year we set ourselves a savings target, and some of them are often quite stretching. In some years we've got, we haven't achieved those. So we set ourselves a contingency based on the risk assessment of those savings, and saying that some of them might not be achieved. So in the year, because they might slip and we might not have to wait for a few months before we achieve them. But last year we achieved 100% of the savings, and it looks like we're on track to achieve them this year. So that's basically just saying that we're releasing a contingency that we set aside just in case we weren't going to achieve the savings, which were quite stretching. But actually, despite COVID and other pressures, it looks like we're on track to achieve those savings. So I can release the contingency to help cover the overspend within children's.
Okay, right, thank you. So what's MTC?
That's what we call the initial savings. It's called meeting the challenge. It was when we sort of first started kind of the austerity process and what it was called, etc. So that's kind of been operating probably since 2009, 2010. But yeah, so that's kind of historic terminology. Yeah.
Okay, lovely, thank you.
And just what's included within the technical and county-wide, it is those kind of technical budgets. One of the big things is repayment of capital loans that we take out. Obviously, it covers all the interest that we pay back on the loans that we take out, plus the repayments. And obviously, we've had some, over the years, significant repayment capital investment, and we generally borrow over 25 years, and we pay that back at kind of 4% a year, which is kind of basically the full amount divided by 25 years. So that's one of the big items in there is the capital financing costs and the repayment of those debts. We tend to hold them centrally because capital we can fund capital programs in a whole variety of different ways. Sometimes from capital receipts, sometimes from borrowing, and so it's just easier to hold that kind of centrally because it makes more sense.
So it's all treasury items, basically.
A lot of it, yeah.
Okay, so not all of it.
And stuff that doesn't sit in with the responsibility of any one director and sits across a number of contingency areas, if you like.
So it's a slush fund.
Yeah. It's either that or council-wide funding is what we're kind of saying.
Okay.
It's not necessarily just all slush to play with.
Yeah, I mean it's not free. It's not free unallocated money. It's allocated to a specific purpose. Like we have to repay our loans. So it's the only really what you might describe as a slush fund was that MTC savings contingency, which I'm saying it is now kind of declared because we don't need it. That was there just in case we didn't achieve the savings. It is actually committed, so it's not available. It's just money that's available and not committed.
No, I meant more in terms of a balancing item, but yeah, okay, understood. Thank you.
Chair, just to pick up the question that Councillor Evans raised, I just look back at the budget setting paper last year and the on the risk assessment of reserves, the figure that we aligned to what would be the risk of overspend was 4.8 million. So that's I mean that was based on roughly 1% of what the budget was that we were setting, and that so I'm not claiming any credit, but we're actually just under that. But we can't afford to be just under that. We need to keep working to drive that down. So that was when we were trying to identify. And I know that's a new approach for Gloucestershire, but that is a more realistic approach in terms of going through your earmarked reserves and general reserves and saying, what's the chances of having to call on that?
Okay. Ben didn't twitch, so I'm going to John Bloxham.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Just a couple of points. I thought the table at paragraph 42 was very helpful. It says in the MTFS that itemisation isn't available. It's very useful to provide a context for members to understand schemes in their area. So if we could be sent a link to where this itemisation appears, we can have a look at, that would be very helpful if someone could send that to us. The other point I wanted to pick up on was the one around the care placement costs in particular. I had a read through the cabinet papers from yesterday, and there are a number of reports there around procurement, where the same kind of themes keep emerging, which is that we don't have in-house provision for many client groups. We're sending a large number of people into out-of-county placements, which is bad for them socially. And the nature of the market is that because we don't have in-house provision, we've got private providers, and the nature of their operation is that they're focused on profit maximisation. There's no blame in using that term. That term's used in one of the reports. That's the character that they have. So they respond to demand when authorities seek to procure placements, which means we don't have a buffer, so that when we want the sector providers to respond to need, there isn't necessarily the provision there. So we're chasing around to find placements. We're going out of area. Presumably that will drive cost pressure because there isn't stuff available at the time that's required in the place that it's required. And in response to this, the strategy coming through from those papers seems to be that we should test the market, procure in smaller lots, split packages up. And I understand that, but that doesn't change the profile of the providers within those sectors. So I think we need to look at a combination of kind of market development, business support for local providers, and also look at in-house provision. No, Trevor House has been mentioned, for example. You know, can we build on that example and look in relation to other types of care needs where we can build in some responsive more local support and be less dependent on high cost out of county placements. Thank you.
Yeah, Steve or Paul? Steve,
yeah, happy to come in on this, Chair, because I've done quite a lot of work in this, both in Gloucestershire and in other places. This works best when you've got a grip of demand. You need to get a grip of demand. So what you can't do singularly is spend a lot of money on developing the market and your own facilities, and be spending a lot of money out of the market on a growing position. So I have said to Chris, and I'm happy to look at those activities, and you may have noticed that in the delegation of yesterday's cabinet, it includes me, because I am really keen that we don't just spend loads of money on developing our own facilities and lose track of the external market as well. So we have to make sure, and I've seen it in other places, you create a really big, nice, shiny new building, and all you do is you fill it with the kids that you would have put external, but you still put the same number of people external. And all you do is you grow demand overall. So I don't want to lose sight with children's social care that they need to get a grip of demand, and they need to work on how and what are children that are coming into care. However, having said all that, we are seeing a growing number. So there's a danger here that you create a forward provision that you're always going to need that external demand. My position is, by all means, we can look at business cases about in county, because not only is that the better outcome for the child, it's cheaper generally. Not always, I would say. It's not always cheaper. And invariably, what happened over a number of years is that local authorities moved away from local registration and local facilities because it was becoming too expensive, and actually the market was more sufficient at delivery and at a better quality. That's changed on its head over the last probably 5 or 10 years, and actually you're better trying to look at local provision. But again, if that demand goes down and we see a turn in social care, you would need to make sure that you do both sides and think about your local service and push down the provision in the external market. So I don't dispute that it's an issue we need to push on, but I'm not saying it's all one or the other. You must do on both sides. You must make sure you're getting a grip of demand and pushing down impact on, and better framework agreements that you've got with those providers. Remember, of course, for some of those local providers, it's in their interest for you not to know and not to future plan and not to be well ahead of the game in terms of demand, because they'll charge the earth for it. I would just air caution, however, not all that can be solved by internally. There are some specialist provisions that you probably can't create in your own area, and isn't in the best interest of a child to be placed locally because of circumstances and relatives or sub-relatives or all sorts of, and those have seen the circumstances know that they are, not just in Gloucestershire, nationally as well. You know, and there are some circumstances where local provision is not the right answer. So you do need to have a flexible market for all that. But I think for us, we do have a number of circumstances where we've got properties available, former care homes, just like Travone, and there's a couple of examples that we're looking at. We need to balance all that out, but make sure colleagues have got a grip of demand. That is going to be the key going forward.
Right, thank you, Chair. Could I just say that I understand the point about managing demand. I just think we need to acknowledge that our focus needs to be on addressing the underlying conditions which generate that demand. So we're not looking at negative gatekeeping just in order to, through assessment processes, push down the level of the number of people we're assisting, because we have to fulfill responsibilities where conditions are such that, you know, older people or young people, people with disabilities have needs that require intervention. But we need to look at those underlying causes and address those through early intervention and other prevention strategies. And that will then be reflected in lower levels of demand ultimately.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I guess the other benefit, Chair, just where we do have a really strong partnership is with our health partners, and in particular in adult social care, of course. There's a much better case made about if you don't control demand in adult social care, it ends up coming back not into just in social care but into health. So we've got a much better, I think, key lever with our health partners to be able to get them working with us, and they do. And I've done it in different places, and it's not been as integrated as it is here. We do work really well with our health colleagues, and you can see those joint activities to drive down the demand in the right places, in those preemptive kind of places. And we know over the next 15, 20 years that the number of older people in Gloucestershire is going to continue to rise. And we need to help that arc, if you like, and how we're going to address that arc going forward. So I'm not disagreeing with anything that you said there, Councillor Boxon.
Ben.
It's just briefly to say that I did meet with Andrew Miller. Andrew's chair of the Children and Family Scrutiny Group, and we are putting together a piece of work around looking at this very question, around the balance between preventative early intervention work, which you know, talk about managing demand, is certainly part of the answer to that, and that piece of work is going to be taken on by Children and Family Scrutiny. A lot of things in, I guess, a lot of sectors, but certainly in children's services, are cyclical. And you know, Steve's mentioned around some of the in-house provision which used to exist, and other things which used to exist and went and come back and come. You know, they are cyclical, and I think in terms of trying to predict demand is very, very difficult. But certainly to look at how we manage that, and also, and I know. It's one of the things Andrew often asks, but it's a very good question, but also how we work with our partners around that as well, you know, in terms of health and schools and education and other things. But yeah, just to say that we are taking that on as a scrutiny committee, because we see it as really important.
Yes, sorry, if I can just add to that, so I know I didn't raise my hand. Yeah, I think that's a really important consideration. However, for Steve's benefit, what we are likely to be doing is not stuff that will have a short-term impact, but a medium to longer impact. So the thesis is that by intervening early, we will be avoiding problems in 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years' time, and we believe it's the right approach. It's the right thing to do from a public policy perspective, but that doesn't mean that we can manage, I think, demand in the short term. Yeah, we'd love to get a grip on demand, but these are medium term, not short term tools that we're going to be looking at. And for other people's, for Phil's benefit, the committee's benefit, I'm proposing that we look at this at our January meeting, so the first meeting in 2022. That will give officers the chance to do the appropriate work to be able to produce us a really quality report. But Ben and I will meet with Chris Spencer before that to set out the terms of the report and the work that we're looking for officers to do. So it's just a bit of, I think, appropriate background to that very important topic which Ben raised.
Thanks, Andrew. I'm looking for any other indications, any raised hands, or if you don't raise hands, anybody wave at the screen if you've got anything that you...
Chair, can I just pick up one issue, I think? And,
Yeah.
and Paul, please correct me if I'm wrong. On paragraph 42 and the table that below there, what happens at budget setting time, you normally set what we used to call parent and child scheme. So you set a category for highway spend on highway schemes at the budget setting based on the overall requirements. And then as soon as possible, when you're into that financial year, you detail that list, which is what that is there. So in terms of Councillor Bloxham asking us to send him somewhere where it's in more detail, this is it where it's in more detail. In the budget setting back in February, it would have just been 1 or 2 lines in the budget setting. So then as soon as we get into the year, this breaks down the detail and we put that out to members. So hopefully that is the detail that wasn't in existence in February.
Okay, thank you. No one else? Well, I've got a line here on the agenda for information items, and I'm going to go back to Stephen with those things that we teased out in relation to the work plan.
So just to say that we're put together a work plan to circulate to members, and that'll be as part of your work planning item in September. So there is a lead member meeting, and you'll note as part of your agenda pack you have a document which is just labelled acronyms. That's something that was requested at the last meeting. We will continue to add to that. So if there are things that you've identified you want added, I think we're meeting the challenge to it. I don't think that's on there, so I'll put that one on there. Obviously, we can still populate that as we go through the meetings, and we'll keep that attached.
Okay. Thank you. With that, we always seem, well, looking at the history of this committee, it's always around 2.5 hours. So can I thank everybody that's participated, particularly the new members. It's been good for my heart this morning. The new members have got really well stuck into the subject. So thank you for all that, and we will see you next time. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Phil. Bye, everyone.
If we can turn off the YouTube stream, that'd be brilliant. Thank you.
You have been removed from the meeting.